In this video, we're going to talk about printing linocuts by hand with some specific instructions around printing from home. So you're going to start with your ink that has either come out of the can ready to print or it's been modified, and you're going to need a palette knife. You may have a palette knife like we use in the studio, but you could also use something like you use in your painting classes. So on a surface, in this case is glass, we're in the studio, I'm going to lay out a couple of generous ribbons of our ink on the glass, slightly more ink than I would if I was using a press, but just minimally so. Now, as I said, we're doing this on a piece of glass in the studio, but if you're at home, you may not have a table covered in glass. Here's the underside of a tray. This is an old tray from the cafeteria, but you might have something plastic laying around in your house, even a piece of mylar taped down to a table. Essentially, you want something that is not porous, that you can clean up when you're done. Okay, rolling my block doesn't look any different than when I'm printing in the studio, although I would say that I'm going to be putting a little bit more ink on the block than I would if I was printing with a press. And that's because a press does a lot of the work of transferring the ink off of the block to get a nice crisp impression. Because we're going to be doing this by hand, I find that a little bit more ink, not too much, but a little bit more ink will give more rich, velvety, kind of filled in impressions. And when I say filled in, I mean all parts that we want to print will print. We never want so much ink that it goes down in between the lines and kind of squishes out during the printing process. So here's my block. It's been inked up in a Prussian Blue, and I go to my template. Now this is the same template that I would use on a press, and the beauty of this is that you can set it up on any kind of flat surface you have. So the one thing that will sometimes happen when you're printing by hand is the possibility that you're going to be rocking that plate around. And so I'm just helping my plate stay in place. I've got a little bit of cardboard at the top to just keep it from moving and a little extra tape onto some non-image areas. You don't have to do that, but I find it can be useful, particularly when you're new to printing by hand, because it doesn't go through the press quickly or uniformly. It's all you. So you'll notice that I'm pressing the paper down slightly with the palm of my hand, and really I'm just trying to get the ink to hold the paper in place for me. And I'm showing you a couple of different kinds of tools that you might be able to use. These first two tools are called barons, and they're variations on a traditional Japanese tool for printing woodcuts by hand. And here's a wooden spoon, a sushi spoon as it turns out, but a wooden spoon, metal spoon, the back of a Sharpie, all sorts of things can work, including a little glass jar. A little glass jar, even though it's not perfectly flat on the bottom, can work really, really well. And you'll see me use some of these different tools later on in the video. You may also want to put down a piece of clear mylar on the back of your paper. If you're printing thin paper, this can help protect it from poking through, from damaging the paper. I find that with most Western style papers, I don't use that because it really just reduces the amount of pressure that I'm getting. So you'll note that I placed a little bit of tape at the bottom of my paper. It's painter's tape, so it will come off quite easily, and it's just an extra fail-safe to keep my printing paper from shifting while I'm printing. So in this instance, I'm using my plastic baron, and I'm putting down a pretty good amount of pressure. This is going to be different for every person, and you're really only going to know how much pressure you need when you print for the first time. We're watching this in real time. I didn't speed up the printing whatsoever because I want you to see how long it possibly takes. Now, if you were to use the back of a thick Sharpie like this, it might take you all day to print your blocks, but sometimes the little Sharpie can be very handy for ensuring that you get some of the finer details that a bigger thing like the baron might miss. So the only way to tell how the printing has gone is to peel back the sheet and have a look. I'm lifting it up to see if I've missed anything, and if I feel confident, I'll just lift the whole thing right back up. I want to avoid laying it back down into the wet ink if I possibly can. And after taking your first few impressions, you'll really get a sense of how much pressure and how long you need to be printing each time. So we're skipping ahead to being done. Let's say we've printed all 10 sheets of paper or whatever we have in mind. Now I want to clean the plate off. If we were in the studio, we would just run it through the press a couple of times on clean sheets of newsprint or phone book. But we have to do this by hand because we're printing in our bedroom or garage or on our kitchen table. So one piece of phone book and a baron. Here you can see I've used a different baron than I used to do the printing demo earlier, and I'm going to strip off some of the ink. Now you'll recall that I mentioned earlier that I use a little bit more ink when I'm printing by hand, and as a result, you're going to need to do this stripping a few times to ensure that most of the ink comes off, and then we'll move on to vegetable oil and a cleaner. In this second cleaning sheet, you'll notice that I used my little jar. Back to our glass slab, and I'm going to use the razor scraper to remove most of the ink. And actually there's a lot of ink on the roller, so I'm going to roll the roller onto the glass or whatever my inking surface happens to be, and that will remove a bunch of ink from the rubber. I'm going to scrape that off. You can see how quickly this goes, and I'll do this actually a couple of times. It really saves the cleaning part. And so we're going to use vegetable oil, and just to be clear here, this is the same kind of vegetable oil you probably have at home in your kitchen. And right onto the kind of scraped up glass, I'm going to roll my roller and ensure that I get a little coating of vegetable oil everywhere and let it sit off to the side. And really what that allows the oil to do is to work on that thin amount of ink that's left behind. If you're in the studio, you have a lot more room to spread out, but here you want to kind of contain the amount of mess that you're using. So any of these cleaners that you just saw me use, any kind of water-based, household cleaner, not something for the toilet bowl, not something with bleach in it, but even something like Windex can work okay for a lot of the printing that you're going to end up doing at home. So I've got a blue shop towel and a little bit of vegetable oil on the shop towel, and I'm beginning to remove the ink from the brayer. And it's the same as in the studio. I'm doing this kind of slowly and methodically to remove as much ink as possible. And I'm going to use a different cleaner here. This happens to be an all-purpose cleaner, but again, this could be any number of the things that you might have under your sink at home. And I'm going to go over the entire brayer, ensuring that I remove as much of the greasy residue as possible. And really the other main difference between doing this at home and doing this in the studio is that rather than moving through a series of different chemicals and products, including something like vinegar, you don't have to do that. You could just use that same cleaner, Windex even, and apply it a second or a third time to ensure that that roller is as clean as it possibly can be, so that when you roll it up next time, maybe in a much lighter color or a much more transparent color, you don't have any of the old ink left behind. So speaking of old ink, if you have some that you plan to use, you can wrap it back up in your little foil packet. You want to try to keep as much air out of it as possible, but you also don't want to squish it to death, because you want to ensure that the ink, you have a blob of it to take out when you go to print next. Back to the blue shop towel that has a bit of leftover oil on it, and I can clean my palette knife. Now, cleaning the remaining ink on the surface of the block is as simple as a blue shop towel and a bit of vegetable oil. This tends to get a little messy, so you want to use as little oil as you possibly can. And you'll note actually that normally I would be doing this with gloves on, but I wanted to show you most of these processes here without gloves on. Not because I want you to get dirty hands, but because I think it's important to see where the dirt is. When you're in a studio, you touch something with dirty hands, we all kind of expect it. But if you're at home and you're wearing gloves and you don't realize you have a big blob of ink on your hands, you're going to put that on your bed or your couch or on your pet, and that's not ideal. So I've removed as much of the ink as I can from the surface of the lino, and there I've just switched to a different cleaner, just again to show you that you have options. And I've sprayed a bit of it onto a shop towel and then glanced quickly over the surface of the block and cleaned it. Now you'll see there's actually quite a lot of life left in these rags here, and you could throw them out. But if you've got like a shed or a garage, you could spread them out and allow them to dry and use them again tomorrow. So back to the vegetable oil to clean up my hands. I put a little vegetable oil on my hands, and I can kind of squeeze everywhere and squish and get as much of that ink off as I possibly can. Wipe it with a shop towel, and then some old-fashioned soap and water, and you're good as new. So I've got one last tip for you. You're printing at home and you get some ink on your clothes or your bedspread. Use some rubbing alcohol to remove the inky stain, and then get it into the washing machine as soon as you can.